As you may know, over the last several years, a lot of things have happened with regard to hay leather replacements, and a lot of things in terms of how to responsibly use different chemicals and materials in a lot of different applications, and fire protection is not any different from that. And this topic tonight has to do with the proper use and disposal and handling of different types of foam. And there's been a lot of rulings that have taken place here with the EPA over the past couple of years. You may have seen an article in the Fire Journal that was, I forget what, last summer. I think it was the June, July issue of Fire Journal. Chris Hanuska, who a lot of you know here, authored that, and Dick Ottman and others from Ansel and Chubb and National and whatnot contributed to that article to try to dispel a lot of the confusion associated with the proper use and handling and disposal of foams and some of the environmental issues that are with which this is concerned. And Dick is going to try to address a lot of those issues and see if we can dispel some of the rumors and myths. Just as an aside, Dick is a retired fire chief from Cottage Grove Fire Department, retired last year, happily, I might add. And he's now moved over living in Wisconsin. He's been with 3M for about 19 years,
18 years tomorrow.
18 years tomorrow. Congratulations. And Dick's also a member of the NFPA 11 Foam Committee and NFPA 403 Crash Fire Rescue, aircraft Crash Fire Rescue, and I forget what the other one was told me.
UL 162.
UL 162, okay, that's right. So I'll leave it to Dick to take it over.
I would see how I do. Puts a lot of pressure on you when you're not an expert because you didn't come from over 50 miles away out of the airplane with these. Let's all plug together. Let's see. Thank you. Now, being from 3M, you can't do a presentation without overheads. So, in fact, there we generally have two sets of overheads, so we can do it that way. Let's see how this is going to work here. No, that works out really well. Is that illegible to anybody here? Okay. I appreciate the opportunity to come talk to you. As I was sitting next to Tom eating dinner, he said, how long is this going to take? And I said, a half an hour. And he said, that's too long. So we're gonna whack her down to about 20 minutes. When Paul asked me to do this, I came to the realization that I knew a lot of, or I think I know a lot about foam, but I really didn't know a lot about the environmental consequences of foam. I get in the surface areas of it, and then pass the ball to our environmental people. We have PhDs on staff that really get involved in it. So I started to do some research on this, and the more research I did, the more I realized that I didn't know, as typical of anything you do. And I came to the realization that we have to do one of two things. We either have to kind of give you a broad brush overview of all of this stuff, or we have to spend 5 days here, and I don't want to do that. It was 40 below where I lived this morning. It was really neat because I got a Celsius scale on one side, a Fahrenheit scale on the other, and they came together this morning. It's pretty scary. What I want to do is touch on a few issues. There's essentially three things that we have to concern ourselves with when we start talking about foam, and that is we've got the toxicology of it, we've got the environmental issues, and we've got the disposal issues. And depending on where you are in the scenario of putting out a fire will determine who's going to be pushing your hot buttons. What I wanted to do, this will be a little difficult to work this way, but let's see how we can do this. Yeah, maybe that's the hot tip, isn't it? Thank you. need to put something between myself and you folks. I just wanted to be able to get something to work off of here. Is anybody here really familiar with foam? Other than, I know Tony's come up and embarrassed me with some questions in some places in the past. I guess he does too, you know. Some, okay, some. What I wanted to do just very briefly is give you a little bit of an overview of foam without going into a great deal of explanation. A little bit of the history of some of the foam types, and then some of the product differentiation. Foam was developed back, oh golly, 50, 60 years ago, and it was a powder. And if you remember the old soda acid extinguishers, that's kind of what this stuff did. They poured it into a hopper, they ran some water through it, it foamed, it generated carbon dioxide, and they poured it on burning hydrocarbon, and hopefully put the fire out. Well, the reality was that by the time they got around to using the powder, it was probably wet, and it was like using a bag of cement powder that you've been sitting in your garage for about 3 years. When you go to use it, of course, it's hydrated and you can't use it. Along came the Second World War, and the Brits, God love him, developed protein foam. Now, protein foam, and I've got some samples of it here. For those of you that are familiar with this, protein foam is just that. It's protein. It's made from parts. It's kind of like going to McDonald's and getting a chicken sandwich. It's just parts. It's blood, it's hooves, it's feathers, it's bone meal, and it's hydrolyzed, and it's stabilized. And don't open this, I'll pass this around. This is straight protein foam. Protein foam, back during the Second World War, was essentially what the British used to extinguish the petroleum fires that every night Hitler would light with his bombing attacks over London. And the Brits would go in and they'd put the fires out. It had some major advantages in that it actually worked. It worked very, very well, much unlike some of the chemical foams. It has some disadvantages. The first one is that it absolutely has to be air aspirated. The second is that it can't go any further than it can physically be pushed by adding more foam to the surface of the burning fuel. And the third one, and those of you in the room might remember back in, I think, Tom, 1975, there were 6 Philadelphia firefighters killed walking through a foam blanket to block a valve at a petroleum storage tank, and it was a protein foam blanket. Protein foam, when you move the blanket, will spread, and if the fire can, it'll get behind you, and as these 6 individuals found out, it's going to be fatal. Back in about, I don't know, maybe 1960, 61, something like that, the Navy, who was a big user of foam for aircraft crash fire rescue, came to the realization that the stuff didn't work quite as well as it should. And they came to 3M, among other people, and they said, can you develop a product for us that works better? And without going into a great deal of detail, yeah, we can, and we turned out a product we call AFFF, which stands for aqueous film forming foam. And initially it was designed as a drop-in replacement at a 6% concentration, and when we say 6%, we mean 6 parts of foam, 94 parts of water, or a 3% concentration, obviously 3 and 97. Is that the end of it? Am I done? This is a 3% AFFF. You can see it's very low in viscosity. It's synthetic. It has no organic parts in it. As a consequence, it doesn't lose shelf life. Protein foam, from what I understand, will lose about 4% of its shelf life over the course of the year because it is organic. This works on essentially 3 principles. The first one is, of course, bubble formation, which is a foam blanket which blocks the vapor from coming off the burning fuel. The second one is because it contains a high amount of water, 97 or 94 parts of water, it'll cool the fire and put the fire out. And the third one, and the most important one, is that it contains a fluorosurfactant. Now, the fluorosurfactant has to do with surface tension. And if you look at hydrocarbons, they generally have a surface tension of around 20 dynes per centimeter. And in order to get something to float on top of that, you have to have something that has a lower surface tension. And in this particular instance, the AFFFs, and I'll try and keep this generic, are down around 15 dynes per centimeter. And so hence they float on the surface of burning hydrocarbons and have a tendency to extinguish the fire. That's the AFFFs. With the advent of the fluorosurfactants, the protein foams, God love them, kicked in as well and developed a couple of other products. One is a fluoroprotein, and this is nothing more than a protein foam that's had some fluorosurfactants added to it. and what is referred to as a triple FP, a film-forming floral protein, which has a much higher viscosity, as you'll see when you play with it a little bit. But this acts to a large degree like an AFFF, and is used by the ICAO people, which is the International Airport Standards, as an equal to AFFF. So that's not done yet here in the United States. The difference, of course, between polar solvents and hydrocarbons is that, as I like to explain to people when I'm teaching this class to fire departments, when I ask them, do you know what a polar solvent is, do you know what a hydrocarbon fuel is, I get mixed reactions, and I ask them then if they know the difference between gasoline and Jack Daniels. And of course, that gets it down to the base, and they say, yeah, I know that. You know, most of the guys here drink gasoline. Polar solvents, obviously, are water-miscible products. AFFFs are water-miscible, therefore they won't extinguish a polar solvent fire, or at least not very, very well. So we have to add things to an alcohol-resistant AFFF to make it polar solvent resistant. And for those of you that are in the sprinkler systems business and the fire design systems business, you have to know what kinds of fuels you're designing to protect for. Because if you design the wrong system, you're not going to put fire out. I equate taking an AFFF to a polar solvent fire like bringing a knife to a gunfight. You're just not going to do the job. To get that polar solvent resistance, we added a polymer, which makes this much more viscous. This has a viscosity of about 1,600 centipoise, where the AFFF that's being passed around is probably down around 4 or 5 centipoise. This polymer, when it sees a polar solvent, precipitates out, forms a blanket on the polar solvent, which then allows the foam to form over the top of the polar solvent and help extinguish the fire. These are what is referred to as 3x6s. They're capable of putting out a hydrocarbon fire. They're used at 3% on hydrocarbons, 6% on polar solvents. There are other agents out there now that are 3x3s, which simplify life. They are used then at both 3% and both instances. That's the alcohol resistant. A couple other things that you'll hear about in the business, and I didn't bring all of them. We have Class A foams, which you've heard about the CAF system, compressed air foam systems. They use Class A's. Class A's started principally in the wildland fire business because they needed penetration, and they're wetting agents, very low viscosity agents, capable of being used on the 1%, and certainly generally not more than 1%. This happens to be Silvex from Ansel. And then there's a whole brand of other people coming out now that are referred to as emulsifiers. And what they will essentially do is emulsify the fuel surface, make it mix with water. Obviously, if it mixes with water, it's not going to burn. This is, don't tell me, let me guess, Fuel Buster that I've got. It looks like cherry cough syrup. You're seeing more and more of these come along as well. And there are some that will tell you that they have a Class B hydrocarbon UL listing. And you have to be a little careful because the type of testing that they do is significantly different than the type of testing done by the AFFFs or the protein foam people who are involved in the Class B UL listings for hydrocarbon fires. Okay, any questions? Did I rattle through that too quickly? Not fast enough. Did you hear about the traveling Shakespearean troupe? We got time for this? That was in this tiny little town, and they only had enough actors and actresses to play the parts, and they had to do some changing around. And at the last minute, one of the actors got sick, and I mean really deathly ill, food poisoning, whatever. So the director was just crazy. He's got to find somebody to play these bit parts. So here's Oldie. He's in the back and he's sweeping the floors. Janitor. The director comes up to him and says, Oldie, he says, have you ever been in a play? Oh, he said, no, I don't think so. He said, what do you think you could be? Oh, yeah, sure, there's nothing to it. So he says, what we're going to do is we're going to get you in a costume. He said, this is Romeo and Juliet. We're going to get you in a costume, and on cue, he said, you have to run out on stage after Juliet has committed this heinous crime, and you look at her and say, Juliet, what have you done? You guys heard this? You've heard it. No. He said, try it. So, Ole looked at him and said, Juliet, what have you done? He said, no. He said, I haven't got time for this. He said, look, He said, a little method acting. He said, we're going to get you in costume. We're going to cue you. You're going to run out on stage. He said, say Juliet, and then take 2 small breaths for emphasis, a pause, and then say, with as much feeling as you can, what have you done? Ole says, no problem. So he gets his costume on, he runs back, they cue him, he runs out on stage. Juliet, what have you done? Okay. Moving along here. I should have put this up. I get too carried away with what I'm doing, and I apologize to you. I just wanted to show you this. We have the proteins, the floral proteins, the film-forming floral proteins, the alcohol-resistant ASSS, class A's. There's a foam type that I didn't put in there, and that's high X, because I don't think that you'll see that very often, although there are a few sprinkler systems that use that. The high expansion foam is generally used by departments that have got like nasty basement fires that don't want to send people down there and put the big fans and blow the foam down in the basements and fill the basements up with foam. High expansion foam goes up to like 1,000 to 1. So if you take a gallon of water and expand it 1,000 times, you can see it's a pretty dry foam. And then the emulsifiers that we talked about. Okay. There's 3 things, as I said, that I'd like to discuss with you as briefly as I can with regard to environmental considerations, and that is that you've got the toxicology issues. What does it do to living organisms? What does it do to people? What does it do to firefighters that are working with this material? You've got the environmental issues. What happens once it's exposed to the environment? What happens when the fire is out? And now you've got, like in the case of Stewart Petroleum down in Jacksonville, Florida, we used 47,000 gallons of agent to extinguish that fire. That has an environmental impact, there's no doubt about it. And last but not least, we've got to worry about disposal. Now that we've got 47,000 gallons of agent and several hundred thousand gallons of water mixed together, what are we going to do with it? So I wanted to put that up just a bit. The first thing that I'd like to get into is toxicology. And I would preface this whole bit of this bottom presentation by telling you that I'm not a toxicologist, I'm not an environmental engineer. I know people who are, and if you've got questions, by all means, feel free to give me a call. It's an extremely complex subject, as you might suspect, because even within the agents themselves, whether it be 3Ms or Ansels or Nationals or ChemGuards or Angus or whomever, the different combinations of chemicals in the agent itself have different effects on different living organisms. Okay? But essentially, NIOSH terminology, can everyone see that? Gives you that definition. Highly toxic, moderately, slightly, practically, and insignificant. And the firefighting agents generally will fall in the practically non-toxic or insignificant toxicity areas. Okay, so 1,000 milligrams per liter. And that's of the concentrate. When we start talking here, we're talking of the concentrate. We're not talking about the diluted agent. We're not talking about the other tens of thousands of gallons we spray on the tank to make the tank cool. There's essentially 3 things that they test when they test toxicity. They test algae, and they test daphnia, which is like a water flea, and they test fish, and they can test a whole different range of fish. And what you'll find is that the different agents and the different components of the agents have different effects on these different living organisms. So you've got to really get very specific if you've got a situation that you're concerned about, and get into the system, whether you call us or you call your another foam supplier. They have people that are capable of helping you out with that regard. There's a couple of terms that you'll see out there. You'll see BOD, which I'm sure you've seen, and COD. BOD stands for biological oxygen demand, and COD stands for chemical oxygen demand. And ironically enough, the more biodegradable a product is, the worse it is in the environment initially. And for those of you that remember the NFO years ago in the state of Wisconsin was dumping milk, remember that? They were all upset because the milk prices were down. Milk, I mean, how big of a pollutant can that be? You know, they dump it in a stream because they were protesting, and all the fish would die. And why is that? Because it took all the oxygen out of the stream. It was extremely biodegradable, and as a consequence, it killed all the fish, killed all the living organisms in the stream. So it's kind of a strange situation when you start talking about BODs and CODs. There's a number that if you divide the BOD over the COD, if the number is less than 0.5, it's considered essentially environmentally acceptable. And how they get that is beyond what I want to go into tonight, but just be aware of that. You'll see a BOD of like 5 or a BOD of 20, and essentially what that number means is the number of days that they tested this for. Because the biological oxygen demand obviously goes down over time for most products. And so the longer it's exposed to the atmosphere, the lower the number should be. Where you might have a high BOD loading initially, and then at the end of 20 days, it's much less. There's a couple other terms that you'll see. You'll see EC, and you'll see EC like EC50, for instance, which stands for the effective concentration. And what they do is they start looking at, when they say EC50, the concentration of agent at that point that kills 50% of whatever it's stuck into. So if you got 100 minnows swimming around, and stick a concentration of this agent in there, and the concentrations vary, obviously. Kills 50 minnows, that's the EC50. And the other thing is the LC, which stands for lethal concentrations, which means we poured that in there and it killed everything. So that's something else you've got to be scientific, knowledgeable about. And as I say, the more I got into this, the more discomfort I had with this subject, because quite frankly, I think it takes a day to really do an adequate job. The next thing that I wanted to get into was the environment. Is there any questions on that? I mean, granted, this is just a real broad brush toxicology thing. We'll talk a little bit more about who wants to come play at your fires in a bit. There was a major development here, oh golly, I don't know, 3 or 4 or 5 years ago, with regard to the environment. And that was the EPA said that the glycol ethers as a category were on the hit list, the hazardous air pollutants list, and can't be discharged into the environment in more than 1 pound quantities without being reported to the EPA. And that really created some problems, and it initially created some problems for the Air Force, because these guys use a lot of AFFF, sometimes because they want to, and sometimes, unfortunately, because they had to. So they wound up having to report. One of the glycol ethers is a product called butyl carbitol, and it's a solvent in just about everybody's foam concentrate. And you're starting now, if you see NFPA journal, the last one, ChemGuard had a big article about their earth-friendly foams, and they've taken butyl carbitol out. And National has taken butyl carbitol out of a couple of their products. Interestingly enough, there's really nothing wrong with butyl carbitol necessarily. It's just that no one had done any testing on it. And as a consequence, what happened was it went into the default category, which was the 1 pound reportable quantity list. So theoretically, depending on what agent you used, anytime that you had more than 1 pound put into the atmosphere, you were supposed to call the EPA. Well, fortunately, on the 5th of July, that rule changed. And to give you an example of how toxic this stuff was, on the 4th of July, had you spilled a pound, you would have had to report it. On the 5th of July, you could have spilled an infinite quantity and not had to call them because they stopped carrying. So it kind of gives you an idea of where we stand here with how this thing works. I brought some things. I think I've got like 30 or 35 copies here, so maybe if there's a couple people that are teamed up here, if you would share one just to make sure everybody gets one. Something that we put together to try and simplify everybody's life, mostly mine. I get tired of answering the phone. This is a real eye chart, and I don't want you to read it because I'm passing it around to you. But essentially what it does is it describes the law as it pertains to reporting. And you're asking yourself, well, what difference does that make to me? And the answer is that if you test a sprinkler system using AFFF, you would have had to have reported it. Now you don't have to. Okay. This goes into some of the reportability issues from a manufacturing standpoint and from a use standpoint. The real meat of this thing is on the back side, and we put it in a bolder type because as of, oh, I told you last, the 12th, there is no reportable quantity for glycol ether, which means that you don't have to report it anymore. Now, does that mean that you can just arbitrarily dispose of this stuff any way you want to? Not really. It's a chemical. And I'd be a little reluctant to tell you that you can just go ahead and spray this anywhere you want to. But the bottom line is that it's now not considered to be the real bad actor that it was 4 or 5 months ago. So, enough of that. We'll get past that. Any questions on that? That was one of the, that I think from a sprinkler system standpoint was one of the biggest questions that I ever got, because we get accidental discharges. We get people that want to test any number of things. Yes, sir.
Is there any problem with discharging that into a sewer?
I'm coming to that, thank you. What a guy. I didn't pay him. He just let me right into that.
Dick, one other question.
Yes,
Is
sir.
this universal to all states, or is this just certain states?
What? No, I'm sorry.
On the CPA department?
The EPA
Some
is
states
federal.
still have the old
You
state standards, more
better, yeah, that's a good question. And the fact that I think everybody here is probably from Minnesota, I don't think that there's a reportable law here in Minnesota. There are in some states. Georgia right now, for instance, is still pretty tight on that. But it's not a bad idea to check. The thing that I wanted to get into more than anything really here at this point was disposal, because that's ultimately what we're all going to be faced with. And assuming, I guess I look at there's essentially two scenarios, two major scenarios that we have to concern ourselves with. One is, have we had a fire? And if we've had a fire, is it a contained fire or an uncontained fire? And the other situation is that we've either had a spill or a test, and is that a contained or an uncontained situation? Now, I would tell you that if you have a fire and it's uncontained, or even if you have a fire and it is contained, everybody's going to want to come and play, right? I mean, we're going to have the EPA there, OSHA's going to be there. If it's on a navigable waterway like the Mississippi, the Coast Guard's going to be there. You can bet Tom's office is going to be there. Everybody is going to want to come and play at your fire. And at that point in time, you're probably not going to have to worry about what you're going to do with it, because they're going to tell you. And I'm not going to be able to tell you what they're going to tell you. That's the interesting thing. I know, and Tom, correct me if I'm wrong here, but the state of Minnesota makes you report like a gasoline spill that's over 5 gallons. Is that right? Okay. Used to be any gas, but they got, I think probably way over reported, so they decided that 5 gallons was going to be it. You've got to use a little common sense with this thing too. There's a couple of things that we've got to concern ourselves with. The first one is foaming. Obviously, these things are designed to foam. They're going to continue to foam. If you use them and then re-agitate them, they're going to re-foam. I made up a little deal in the lab this morning just to see what I could do. And this is water, just good old St. Paul tap water, which probably would foam by itself. No offense if there's anybody in here. Just the water department.
Just the water department.
This is our 3% mil-spec AFFF, which is one of our Cadillac products. At 1/10 of 1%, okay? I put in 1/10 of a gram and I added 99.9 grams of water to it. And just to show you that at 1/10 of 1%, we foam. We make a lot of foam. We make a ton of foam. Now what you're doing is you're discharging that into a stream or a river or onto the ground or something somewhere. Somebody is going to call WCCO and they're going to say, what the heck is going on out here? You know, call News 511 or whatever. They got all those hotline numbers to call. So that's the first thing. You've got to be concerned about foaming. Because if there's going to be a problem, this is going to be the first problem, generally. Because what is all this foam doing here? We had an accidental hangar trip down in South Carolina a year ago last summer. And this old fire chief called me up, typical South Carolina accent, which I can't do very well, and he says, y'all make a damn fine foam. He says, I got foam covering 2 acres, 6 feet deep. And I think he was telling me the truth. And then he said, then the wind come up. And he said, it blew it over against the school. He said, the school is 1 story high, and he said, the foam is 2. And I suggested that maybe it would be a good time to go get the kids, because probably in South Carolina they've never seen snow. You know? But that's going to be the first problem. That's going to be your first dilemma. The second one, with regard to disposal, is fuel contamination. And the reason I'm kind of laundry listing all of these things is because I've got a 9-page single-spaced typewritten document here that addresses every one of these issues, so I don't have to tell you what the answers are. You can just kind of dig in here and find them for yourself. There is a slight emulsification using an AFFF or an alcohol-resistant agent or a protein with the fuel. You're going to get some slight emulsification. Now, there's essentially 2 things that you can do. One thing, it's kind of an imperative if you want to separate these 2 things, and that is to run it through a fuel wire separator. And the second thing is, which kind of works a lot, is for a lot less money, is just let Mother Nature take care of it, because if you let it sit long enough, it's going to sort itself out, right? Because oil and water don't mix. We know that to be the case. So a lot of times, if you just let it sit long enough, the stuff will just separate by itself, to the point where, I can't cite chapter and verse, but I've heard rumors that after we've extinguished gasoline tank fires, that they've just let the product sit for a period of time and just sold it. Didn't bother to re-refine it or anything. I think I bought some at once, but that's kind of what happens. The other thing is that there is glycol ethers in here. And as you'll see from that thing, that there still are some concerns about cleanup. And now there are other solvents that are coming out. ChemGuard and National have put in another solvent that is not on the reportable list, and the glycol ethers are no longer on the reportable list either. But the reality is that from a toxicology and an environmental standpoint, they're about the same. So you've got to have a concern about that. And then the last one, and this is something that there's a lot of study being done. There has been a lot of study done, and a lot of study ongoing. In fact, we had a meeting on Tuesday morning this last week to talk about this. And that is the persistence of the fluorosurfactants. Now, they're in there in a very, very minute quantity. Most are in there less than 1% in the concentrate. So you take that 1%, now you dilute it 97 parts or 94 parts with water, so you're getting even smaller concentrations. But the bottom line is that fluorine as a chemical is stable. So when the hydrocarbon surfactants are chewed up by the bugs, the fluorine surfactants are still there. And the question that I don't think anyone has answered yet, although we're comfortable with it, is that they're inert. They're totally inert. They're like rocks in the bottom of a river. They've been there 1,000,000 years, and unless some kid picks them up, throws them up on land, they're going to be there another 1,000,000 years. They will pass through your body. We know that. If you ingest some for some reason or another, they'll just pass through. They have no bodily harm to you. I work with this stuff every day. I'm fine. But there's still some unanswered questions, and we're looking at that because one of the unanswered questions is, well, yeah, they're inert, but then what? What are they going to do? What happens? Where do they go? Do they bioabsorb? Do they eventually biodegrade? Do they migrate? We don't know. That's an ongoing thing, and I think all the foam suppliers are working on that. Anyway, what I wanted to do is, this kind of reads like Gone with the Wind. And here again, there's 30 copies of it here. If you wouldn't mind, if you don't need two, maybe just pass one. Did everybody have enough, by the way, the first time around? Take this, and if you find yourself in a dilemma with any of the things that we talked about, by all means, feel free to reference this, or call me, or call Paul, because he knows where I work. We talk about disposal. We talk about sewering the product in here, how many milligrams per liter for thousands of liters of stuff, like if it's going to Pig's Eye. I mean, it isn't hardly going to make a difference, but I live in the city of Prescott. One of the phone calls I got, this was kind of funny, a couple of years ago, I had this call from this lieutenant commander down at the Jackson Naval Air Station. They had an aircraft carrier come in, and they were within the 3-mile limit when they tested their sprinkler system, so they contained the water. And they came in, and of course they have to hook up to municipal sewers when they're in port, and they dumped their tank. And this lieutenant commander called me, and he said, I have got 10 feet of foam in my aeration basins, everywhere. What am I going to do? So I said, well, not a problem. In here, we have a list of defoamers, and we've rated them by efficiency. We give you 800 numbers to call to buy them, if you choose to. We tell you which ones work best and which ones work least. And I think there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, there's 9 of them here to choose from. We tell you how many gallons of agent you can send to the sewage disposal system. We suggest that you get in touch with the people and let them know that it's coming, so that they don't call me and say, I've got 10 feet of foam in my aeration basin. We talk about another area in the back here, which I would wish we kind of get out of here. We talk about thermal decomposition, which means if you're going to spray the stuff on a fire, what happens to it? And the reality is, like, I don't care. I've fought a couple of tank fires in my firefighting career, and I'm not going to go up there on top of that tank and say, well, gee, I don't know what's happening to stuff. But anyway, it's in here. So if you care to pass that around, not a problem. Going to make sure I covered everything here. The bottom line for sprinkler systems, people, is that if you want to do a test using foam, the recommendation in there, my recommendation, is that you contain the water and send it to a sewage disposal. They're capable of treating it. They generally, if you feed it down at the appropriate rate, won't even know that it's there. And it goes through the sludge process, it goes through the biodegradation, and what gets sent out into the atmosphere is essentially harmless. So, one of the other questions that we get from time to time is, okay, I want to do a test like that. How do I get rid of it? Got another answer here for you. Pass these around, if you will. We've used this service. They do it for a living. I'm not so sure that Bay West wouldn't be able to do the same thing for you, but these people have been contacted and they know that we might be using them from time to time. But they're everywhere, pretty much. You know, the nice thing about living in Minnesota, from about the end of November until the middle of March, is you can clean up after your dog with a 5-iron. Give it to the neighbor. Yeah. So anyway, I realize that it's very brief and it's a very broad brush look, and we didn't even begin to start talking about a lot of the real technical things. But I hope I've given you a little bit of reference material here that'll get you into something if you feel you need the help. Are there any questions or comments? Yes, sir.
You kind of talked about the cleaning up, like this would be after discharge. Is there a difference then if you're working with just concentrated cells? Because I know when we were installing one like out at the airport, well, for one thing, the stuff was so slippery, that A-trip left.
Right.
We couldn't put flanges on it, or threaded fittings, or groove fittings. We had to have the guy come in and weld the stuff. That kept coming out of the joints. and then you get all the rags, the piles, and puddles on the floor and stuff like that, and if there's any difference of how to clean that stuff up.
Everybody hear the question? How do you clean up this stuff? First of all, with regard to putting pipes together, if you call me in the morning, I'll give you our recommendations on pipe thread sealants, which we have used that we know that are impervious to this stuff. Okay, I don't have it off the top of my head, but it's there. If you spill this material or find yourself having to clean up a quantity of this stuff, the easiest thing that we found to use is kitty litter or diatomaceous earth. It absorbs it. The last thing in the world you want to do is spray this stuff with water. I mean, I promise you. You get a 5 or 10 gallon AFFF spill on a hanger floor and you spray it with water and it's going to be a mess. Kitty litter is a good, or bentonite clay, oil sorb, whatever, will absorb it, and then you can landfill it. I mean, it's not harmful. You can landfill it, that's not a problem. Or squeeze the rags out and use it over again. But yeah, I mean, that's what I would do. Yes, sir?
Do you know of any fire department that's ever been cited for improper cleanup after utilization?
No. No, Tom, and I tell you what, the reason that I got into this was because I was being badgered by principally the military. And so I had probably 7 or 8 or 10 contacts a week. And I do not know of any fire department, any municipal or industrial fire department that's ever been in any kind of trouble as a result of using foam.
Nor do I.
No. See, the interesting thing is, what's the alternative? You got a 300-foot diameter crude oil storage tank on fire that's 48 feet high. You want to burn? You know, we're talking about air pollution? Doesn't make sense. You got to do something. You know, we were talking at dinner how much trouble you can get yourself into being in the municipal department. You know, you go in and save the snake, and then you pull the snake out by its tail, and its head goes boom, 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 boom down the steps. You know, you're a hero. You saved the snake, but you should have done it the other end. I went in. I was telling the story. When I was an engine company captain, and kind of, I went in. We had a house fire, and this lady comes up to me and she says, "I've got this iguana. You have to go find my iguana." Well, the fire was in the basement. Well, the iguana was upstairs. It was smoky. So I went in and I said, "Well, what does it look like?" And she told me, and she said, "Well, it's about this big." Really? Honestly. And I've got the Kevlar gloves, and I've got the turnout gear and my SCBA and everything on. So I go in, of course, I look like Darth Vader. Well, this iguana is half overcome with smoke. But as I was just walking in the door, she said, "Be careful, he bites." He wasn't going to bite me, I'll tell you what. I mean, he was so glad to get out of there. It was unbelievable. You know, but you can't win. You can't win. You put it out, and then clean it up. So, anything else? 8:30. Is it time? I'm out of jokes.
Thank you again for, Dick, thank you for the presentation, and thank you again for turning out. Remember, it's the 29th, not the 28th, it's Thursday. Thanks again. Have a good evening.
Piece of evidence to convict Dorian of murder.